This video should get you through the first half of the respiratory system, which is chapter 22. We're going to start out by talking about the upper respiratory system and then the general process, and then in the next video we'll talk about the lower respiratory system and the mechanics of breathing. So to start you out, major function of the respiratory system, usually people give me something like oxygen coming in, but you need to remember there's two respiratory gases that we're going to be exchanging, oxygen and carbon dioxide. So what we're supposed to do here is breathe atmospheric air, which is a mixture of nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, and some other things as well, and then get the oxygen out of that air and into our bloodstream so that we can get it to our cells, which need the oxygen or they'll die, and then help get rid of the carbon dioxide that the cells produce during cellular respiration, and then exhale that back to atmospheric air. So gas exchange is just sort of the summary of that overall process. There's four things that have to happen in order for you to respire. Respiration is not just breathing. Ventilation is breathing. Respiration is more than that, and there's different terms and different types of respiration. Cellular respiration is something we're going to talk about in a later chapter, which is incidentally the reason why we're doing all of this is for cellular respiration. This is more about gas exchange and then gas transport. So first off, you have to breathe. Breathing gets air in and out of the lungs so that you can do the remainder of the steps. If you've been paying any attention to COVID-19, because COVID-19 has major respiratory issues or symptoms, people who have severe COVID-19, they have to be put on ventilators. And so because they can't do ventilation for themselves, we put them on machines that do the ventilation for them. Step 2, external respiration is gas exchange between the air sacs in the lungs called alveoli and then the bloodstream, so that we can get the oxygen from the air into the blood and the carbon dioxide from the blood back into air so that we'll be able to exhale that later on. Transport, that's all about the circulatory system. We hit that in previous chapters when we talked about blood. Internal respiration is between tissues and the bloodstream, so it's not about the respiratory system per se, it's about the blood that contains the oxygen, getting rid of that oxygen and dropping it off at the tissues, and then picking up carbon dioxide from the tissues and putting it back in the bloodstream, where it'll then be transported back to the lungs so that we can do more external respiration. And so these three things are basically happening at the same time. Oh, wait, I got video.
Respiration serves as a means for the body to exchange gases with the atmosphere via the blood. The partial pressure of oxygen, PO2, in the air in the alveolar spaces in the lungs is greater than the PO2 in the blood, so oxygen diffuses into red blood cells from air in the lungs.
That is a type of external respiration. And when it says PO2, it's talking about the partial pressure of oxygen. We'll talk about what partial pressures mean later on.
Also, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, PCO2, in the air in the lungs is less than the PCO2 in the blood. So carbon dioxide diffuses out from red blood cells and into the air in the lungs. Oxygen-rich blood is carried through pulmonary veins to the heart and then pumped through systemic arteries to the body. The PO2 in the blood is higher than the PO2 in the body tissues, so oxygen diffuses out from red blood cells and the body tissues.
Okay, I'm going to pause it right there again. So tissues can be anything. It can be like a neuron in the brain, it can be a hepatocyte in the liver, it can be an epithelial cell. These cells are all carrying out cellular respiration, and in the process of doing that, they are constantly consuming oxygen. And since they're consuming oxygen, they need a constant supply of oxygen. And so that oxygen is going to diffuse in there to help supply that need. In that same process, these tissues are going to be producing carbon dioxide, so the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is going to be higher in that tissue, which is why the next step happens.
Also, the PCO2 in the blood is lower than the PCO2 in the body tissues, so carbon dioxide diffuses into red blood cells there. Oxygen-poor blood is carried through systemic veins back to the heart and is pumped through pulmonary arteries to the lungs, where gas exchange again replenishes the blood with oxygen and removes carbon dioxide.
That's a really good summary video of the overall process. You can search for that video. The title of it is right there, but it can help you learn what's going on there. All right, next up. There is a step 5 that happens. Some editions of the book mention the step, some don't. But step 5 is the whole reason you have a respiratory system, and I've alluded to it before. Cellular respiration is the process that burns fuel, the nutrients that you consume, so that you can make ATP. And the process of doing that, your cells produce carbon dioxide, so you need oxygen so you can do this, and you produce CO2 as you do this, and so you need that constant exchange of gases so that your cells can do this. If your cells stop doing this, you die. And so again, all of this is happening so that your cells can carry out cellular respiration. All right, after that you have this picture to label. It's straight up from the textbook. The respiratory system is generally divided into the upper respiratory system and then the lower respiratory system. If you've ever been diagnosed with an upper respiratory infection, that's really just a respiratory infection that's from the larynx on up. They're not life-threatening, they're uncomfortable, they're unpleasant. You have symptoms like coughing, sneezing, runny nose, sinus, headache, but they're not going to kill you as a general rule. Lower respiratory infections are vastly different. That would be like tuberculosis, pneumonia, Legionnaire's disease. There's other examples of those, but those are life-threatening because they directly interfere with that gas exchange that we just got through talking about. And so lower respiratory infections are much more severe. Let's see, basic stuff. Nostrils let air in to the nasal cavity. Nasal cavity warms, moistens, and filters some large particulate matter out of the air that you breathe. At the back of that you have the pharynx. The pharynx has 3 regions: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx. There are tonsils in those, so you have the adenoids or the pharyngeal tonsils up here, you have the palatine tonsils, and then you have the lingual tonsils. Both the palatine and the lingual are in the oropharynx. The adenoids or the pharyngeal tonsils are in the nasopharynx. Those are helping to filter bacteria out of the air that you breathe in. The epiglottis helps to close over the larynx as you swallow food so that your food doesn't enter the larynx, which houses the vocal cords, which are responsible for the sounds necessary for speech. And then below that you have the trachea. The trachea splits at the bottom into a right and a left main bronchus or primary bronchus. Each one of those goes to each lung. The right lung has 3 lobes, superior, middle, and inferior, and then the left lung has 2 lobes, superior and inferior. The diaphragm is the prime mover for inspiration. There's also going to be intercostals that we talk about a little bit later on, but this is your basic anatomy, your very rudimentary anatomy of the respiratory system. What does the respiratory zone do and which portions make it up? So this is the zone that actually does gas exchange. So this would be the lower respiratory system, the lungs themselves. The lungs consist of all these tiny little air sacs called alveoli is plural, alveolus is singular. This is where oxygen is going to get into the bloodstream and CO2 is going to come from the bloodstream into the alveoli so you can breathe. It's got a very thin membrane that makes it up, but this is the respiratory zone. The conducting zone is different, and it's most of the rest of the respiratory system. So this is like your bronchi, your trachea, all of your upper respiratory system. The whole job of this is just to conduct air to and from the lungs. So we're not doing gas exchange in this system. We're just moving the air up and down so it can get where it's supposed to go. Functions for the nose, pretty self-explanatory. Make sure you get that. This is just a nice little weird picture. If I remember correctly, the dude had cancer on his nose, and so they had to remove large chunks of it, and so they grew him a new nose on his forehead and then moved it back down out of his own tissues, and so that eventually got moved off down there. This is just the external nose, which helps to keep your nostrils open so that you can breathe in and out. Most of the function of the nose is actually happening inside of the nose, and so moistening and warming the air is very important. I don't know if you've ever been outside when it's super duper cold, but if cold air hits your lungs, it actually hurts, and that's because your lungs really weren't meant for cold, dry air to hit it. There's these nose hairs that are inside the nose. They help to filter the air out. There's also something called turbinates in there that helps to sort of create turbulent flow of the air inside the nasal cavity, and that helps to bounce particulates off the side so they don't make it deeper in there. After that, I gave you this picture of the upper respiratory system. This one is giving you a lot more detail. It labels some of the stuff that I mentioned earlier, and then some things that I didn't. So nostrils bring the air in. These are the turbinates, not that you guys need to know that, but you can also see the sinuses. So the frontal sinus is in the frontal bone, sphenoid in the sphenoid bone. There's other sinuses that you can't see in this picture, like ethmoid and then maxillary sinuses. Those do all connect back to the nasal cavity, so that if you end up with a nasal infection called rhinitis, it can spread to the sinuses and then called sinusitis. And that usually, well, not usually, it often needs antibiotics to treat that. From the nasal cavity, you end up in the pharynx, which again has 3 parts. They are named based on what's in front of them. So the nasopharynx, the nose is in front of that. The oropharynx, the mouth is in front of that. And the laryngopharynx, the larynx is in front of that. So nasopharynx goes from the soft palate up to the top. The soft palate down to the epiglottis is the oropharynx, and then the epiglottis down to this little hump right here, that's going to be the laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx does have the pharyngeal tonsil, which is again also called the adenoids. The opening of the pharyngotympanic tube, that's the tube that connects back up to the middle ear, which is another one of the reasons that infections that start in your nasal cavity can end up traveling up to the ear and cause ear infections as well. We talked about that a little bit last semester. Soft palate extends down to the uvula. That's the little punching bag thing that you can see at the back of your throat. In the oropharynx, you have the palatine tonsils, one on either side. I showed you those getting removed in a previous video back in, I think, the lymph system. The isthmus of Fosse is just the opening from the mouth to the pharynx. So when you swallow food, it goes down through that so that you can come down here. Lingual tonsil is at the back of the tongue. You got your tongue, you got your hard palate, all that jazz. You can breathe through the mouth. You've probably all met that kid who could squirt milk out of his nose. That's because these are connected, so you can get back up there. There is also a little, if you remember, there's a canal that drains the tears down into the nasal cavity that you can't see in this picture. So there are people who can squirt stuff out of, like squirt milk out of their eyes, and that's because there's a connection through there as well, although you should not be squirting weird stuff out of your eyes like that. All right. Now, here's one of the quirks in human anatomy. The digestive system and the respiratory system, we don't have 2 separate ones. Well, at least we don't have 2 separate openings for those. And so it is possible for us to swallow food down the wrong pipe. We have some things to protect us from that. This is the epiglottis. Whenever you swallow food, the epiglottis pulls down and that closes off. Let me see, I'm going to doodle. That closes off this opening to the larynx right here, so that when you drink or eat, the food is supposed to go down the esophagus like so. If you're talking or laughing as you eat though, that tends to confuse or overwhelm the epiglottis so it doesn't close completely, and as a result your food ends up going down this way, and so that's what it means when you swallow food down the wrong pipe. There are animals out there that can't do that. They have a completely separate respiratory system pathway and a completely separate digestive system pathway, so they can't swallow food down the wrong pipe. But humans can, because they both start in the mouth, and well, you can go down the nose, but again, food generally doesn't go down there unless you have an NG tube, which we'll talk about later. All right, so we were talking about the epiglottis. Next up, I'm going to switch back to not using the pen. These 2 little folds right here, you have the vestibular fold and then the vocal fold. The vocal fold is what vibrates to allow you to speak. The vestibular fold really just helps to protect that, so that if food does come down this way, you don't damage the vocal fold. You've got some really large cartilage up in the larynx to help keep it open and help to ankle those vocal folds that we were just talking about. So this is what in guys are called Adam's apples, because it gets to be very large in guys. It can in girls too if they have specific hormones, but that hormone is called the thyroid cartilage, even though the thyroid's actually way down here. At the back of the larynx, you have another big piece of cartilage that's called the cricoid cartilage. That again is just helping to maintain the openness, and it wraps around to the front but gets narrower, so this is also the cricoid. After the cricoid cartilage, you start to get little rings that are all about the same size. Once you get to the area where the rings are all the same size, at that point you're in the trachea. And so everything from there on down is the trachea, which still has cartilage, it's just smaller. So that's your anatomy of the upper respiratory system. Now in your picture in the notes, you also have a label to this. You should remember that from last semester, but if you don't, that's the hyoid bone. Remember, that's the only bone that doesn't articulate with another bone. It just helps to anchor some of the muscles that go for the tongue. All right, these things you can get the definitions of really easy, so I'm going to kind of skip past a whole slew of this stuff. This one I'm going to pause on for just a second. So most of the respiratory system is going to be lined with this pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue. We're going to have goblet cells that make a lot of mucus. That mucus is going to help trap particulate matter that's in the air, so it's part of the filtering process. There are a couple of places in the respiratory system, though, where we instead have stratified squamous epithelial tissue, and those are going to be the places where we have a shared function between the digestive system and the respiratory system, or places that might be subjected to a little bit more friction, like right at the opening to the nasal cavities. All right, we talked about lysozyme earlier. The which way the mucus is being propelled is actually fairly easy to figure out. I do have another video to show you. Although this one's going to be lower, but it hits an important point.
The air that enters the nose needs to be warmed, moistened, and filtered before it gets to the lungs. This is because air contains suspended matter such as pollen, bacteria, dust, fungal spores, and viruses. The cells lining the respiratory tract play an important role in filtering the air and cleaning the nasal passages. They are of two types: ciliated epithelial cells and goblet cells, which secrete mucus.
Okay, so the mucus is always going to be trying to go back towards the digestive system. So in the nose, the cilia propels the mucus backwards so that you can swallow it. That's actually what your body wants to happen. Mucus is a protein, so your body can digest that down no problem and recycle the components, the amino acids for it. The other thing that I want to talk about here, so your book hits pretty heavily later on something called the mucociliary escalator. Your cilia is continuous and it helps to take mucus up. Even with the goblet cells, they're smushed down towards the bottom, so there's not a gap in the cilia like it's showing you right here. One of the ways that smoking damages your respiratory system is it damages that escalator, and so your body's not able to push the mucus out like it's supposed to, so instead it sort of tumbles back down into the lungs, which is why people who smoke tend to get more respiratory infections, and it's why they cough a lot. It's because their escalator's broken, and so the mucus keeps falling back down and causing problems for them. All right, let's see, rhinitis, nasal infection, sinusitis, we talked about just a little bit earlier. Make sure you get the stuff that you need there. Remember, pause the video so you can get what you need. Also, don't forget the PowerPoint posted for you guys so you can get it there. Pharynx, for this chapter, its function is airway, but remember it is part of the digestive system too. Your tonsils are located here, most of them, and so we also have a little bit of a filtering aspect that goes along with the pharynx. This is also where we switch from being the stratified squamous epithelial tissue, non-keratinized, to the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue. So parts of it have this, parts of it have this. It just kind of depends on where you are. Epiglottis, I kind of hit its function earlier. Larynx is voice box. Now, NG tubes are nasogastric tubes. There are people who cannot feed themselves or they cannot swallow appropriately, and for people who can't swallow correctly, they're at a much higher risk of something called aspiration pneumonia, because if you choke on food a lot, essentially you're adding liquids into your lungs, and so that's what leads to the pneumonia and the infection that comes after that. So for those people, you can feed them with nasogastric tubes, and what you do is you insert the tube through the nasal cavity. If the person is communicative and you can talk to them about it, you ask them to swallow as you're putting the tube in, and that helps to ensure that the epiglottis comes down so that the tube goes down the esophagus to the stomach. Then you pump the food in there to feed them. If you misplace this tube and it goes down the trachea instead, and then you insert a bunch of liquid food in there, you've just pumped it directly into the lungs, and so you are drowning the patient. And so that tube needs to be placed in the esophagus because its point is feeding. I have seen nurses inappropriately put this tube down into the trachea. There are tests that you should do before you start pumping food in. Usually we just take a big old syringe and we pump some air in. If you pump some air in and it's in the stomach, the person's going to burp and their stomach is going to expand. No big whoop. Now you know you're in the right place, so you can pump the food in next. If you pump the air in, though, and the lungs expand, you're in the wrong place. And better to catch it with a pump of air than it is with a pump of food. And so no matter how rushed you are as you're working in the industry, always test to make sure you got the tube in the right place before you pump the food in, because that's a malpractice suit just waiting to happen if you put it into the wrong place. Laryngitis is fairly self-explanatory. So next up, trachea is really just the airway or the windpipe. Most Actually, all of the trachea is going to have rings of cartilage that go down it. If you look up and feel the front of your throat, you can actually feel those horizontal bands of cartilage. They help to keep it open. We've got the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium that lines the entirety of the trachea. We have more mucus glands in addition to goblet cells, lots of mucus being made here. The back does not have the cartilage. That allows, if you swallow a big bolus of food, it allows the esophagus to expand anteriorly for a moment so the food can pass. But once it's passed through there, everything's going to go okay again. This is the tissue makeup that goes along with the trachea, and you actually saw this slide last semester as you were looking at tissues, because this was your example of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue, which you can see up here. Again, notice that wonderful mucociliary escalator that I mentioned earlier, and then the goblet cells. You also saw this slide for the hyaline cartilage, which is what helps to keep this airway open. Now the submucosa is going to have a bunch of seromucus glands. Guess what they make? It's in the name. They make a lot of mucus. So not only do we have the goblet cells making mucus, we also have the seromucus glands making mucus to help trap that particulate matter that might be going around through here. How does smoking damage it? Primarily, we're going to be damaging that escalator that I was talking about. So this is, again, what we should look like. Nice, complete carpet of cilia all the way across the top. If you look at this biopsy off down here, you can see there are places where we have pits where there are no cilia. That's a place where the mucus isn't going to be able to travel past that, and so it's going to, again, tumble back down. And so that's part of the problem that goes along with that, is it damages the cilia so you can't clear the mucus anymore. This time we're going up towards the esophagus. Heimlich Maneuver, they're trying to change the name of this because apparently the Heimlich family wants like money for Dr. Heimlich having come up with this. I don't know. So they're all trying to switch the name to abdominal thrusts at this point. But if you have a person who has swallowed food down the wrong pipe, aka food or drink has gone down the trachea, food is where you would use the Heimlich Maneuver. So whenever you try to do the Heimlich Maneuver, what you want to do is get behind the person, make a fist with one hand, put that hand just above the above the belly button, below the diaphragm. So basically right about here is where you're going to put that fist. Reach around with the other hand and then grab your fist, and then you want to pull back and up really forcefully. Again, you don't want to be gentle here because gentle's not going to get the food out of this person's trachea. So you have to pull hard and fast up and back so that you can hopefully get whatever's in their trachea out of their trachea. If you get it out, they'll probably start coughing and then spit out whatever the food was, and then you know they're going to be okay. Heimlich Maneuver is actually very, very difficult to perform on yourself with enough force to get something out. So if you're ever alone and you're choking on food, what you're supposed to do is kind of fling yourself over the back of a chair. It's better to break some ribs than it is to die because you can't breathe. And so keep that in mind whenever you're choking on your own. All right. From the trachea, we're going to split into the primary bronchi. Again, there's two, a right one and a left one, one for each lung. From there, what happens is the bronchial tree keeps splitting over and over again. So the primary bronchi becomes secondary bronchi, those become tertiary, and blah, blah, blah. We just keep splitting over and over again until we end up with really teeny tiny tubes down at the very bottom. For secondary bronchi, there's one secondary bronchus for each lobe of the lung, and so that means there's 3 of them on the right side, but only 2 of them on the left side. This was just a really interesting case that I wanted to show you. So you can read the whole story that kind of goes along with over here. This dude had some major problems with both his circulatory system and his respiratory system. He started to bleed into his bronchial tree. This is not the bronchial tree. It is a perfect cast of the bronchial tree. This is a giant blood clot that had gotten stuck in his, on the right side. And you can actually see the 3 little branches that go along for the lobar, lobar bronchi. So this is just a giant blood clot that had gotten stuck in that tree, and you can see it very well. He felt a lot better after he coughed this up, but he still ended up not surviving afterwards, and so it's beautiful, but it's kind of horrific at the same time. All right. Once you get down to the really teeny tiny tubes, they are called bronchioles. Once you get to the bronchioles, you've lost the cartilage completely, so there's no longer cartilage that's trying to keep the airway open. We've picked up some smooth muscle so that these can constrict. That's called bronchoconstriction when that happens. And we start to get these little bubbles that pop up periodically. Each one of those bubbles is an alveolus. or alveolus. I really don't care which way you want to say that. A cluster of them is called an alveolar sac. And so that's what's going on once you get to the terminal bronchioles. Kind of mentioned this just a second ago, but again, we lose the cartilage. I never close parentheses. I really need to start doing that. The epithelial type changes. We're going to lose that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue, and we're going to move towards the thinnest tissue that your body can make, which is simple squamous epithelial tissue. The reason that we're doing that is now we're not so concerned about filtering the air. It's been filtered fairly well by the time we got here. Now we're more concerned with gas exchange. And so gas exchange happens better if the membrane is thinner. And so that's why we're doing that. And then we're going to increase the amount of smooth muscle that's in the wall so that you can close off parts of the lungs if a person's breathing dirty air, if they have an infection or something like that. And so those changes are happening as we go through there. Oh, all right. The alveoli, this is the most important part of the lungs, and it makes up the bulk of the lungs. So when you well, I don't guess you'll get to dissect the fetal pig if we don't get to go back to class, but when you dissected the rat last semester, you may have noticed the lungs are very flimsy, and they're very spongy, and they're very soft. And that's because most of the tissue of the lungs is made up of these alveoli, which are just little tiny air sacs made out of simple squamous epithelial tissue. I kind of want to use the analogy of these are sort of like grape clusters. So if you go buy a package of grapes, the stem that the grapes come on, those are bronchioles. Each individual grape is an alveolus, and so that's where the gas exchange is going to happen. A cluster that comes off of one branch is called an alveolar sac, and so this is where the gas exchange is going to be happening, is in those little sacs. The respiratory membrane, I usually ask students to doodle this picture up over here. There's 3 parts to it. You have the simple squamous epithelial tissue of the alveolar wall. You have the basement membrane, which is the connective tissue glue that's going to glue these 2 sheets together. And then you have the simple squamous epithelial tissue that makes up the wall of the capillary. So you have the 2 thinnest tissue types that you can make glued together with a really thin sheet of connective tissue. Everything about this was designed to not be a barrier because we're trying to get gas to exchange between these 2 places. And so we're not super protective here. Instead, we have no barrier so that we can do gas exchange most efficiently. What's the function for that simple squamous epithelial tissue? Just gas exchange. So last semester when you looked at simple squamous epithelial tissue, this was the slide that we showed you. Lots of air sacs. So like that's an alveolus, that's an alveolus. This is an alveolar sac. So that's a cluster of a whole bunch of them in one place. There's capillaries all throughout here. They're kind of difficult to see. You can see them in a couple of different places. But again, everything about this designed to be as small as we can possibly make it so that oxygen can diffuse into the capillaries and carbon dioxide can diffuse out of them. In addition to having the simple squamous epithelial tissue that makes up the wall of an alveolus, there's a couple of other special kinds of cells that hang out in here. One of them, the green fluffy one here in this picture, is a type 2 cell. It produces something called surfactant. What the surfactant does is it reduces the surface tension of water. So the problem here is your respiratory membrane has to be very, very thin, and it has to be very, very moist. If it is not moist, oxygen and carbon dioxide can't diffuse across it very easily. The problem with that moisture is water, as you can see in this GIF, likes to draw itself up into a bubble. If that were to happen inside of the alveoli in your lungs, what it would do is it would pull the bubble shut. So the water inside your lungs essentially tries to make your lungs collapse. The type 2 cells that produce surfactant prevent this from happening. That allows the water to stay as a thin film on the surface instead of drawing the alveoli up into a closed little bubble. So surfactant prevents what's happening in this GIF from happening so that your lungs don't collapse. Shortest way I can say that is surfactant prevents your lungs from collapsing. Okay. What 3 features help the alveoli carry out their function and remain sterile at the same time? So the first 2 are about the functionality. First off, we've got a ton of elastic fibers. In this little cartoony picture, it's the yellow fibers on the outside. What that means is after you have breathed in and you have expanded the alveoli, the elastic fibers are going to try to push the air out. So it makes breathing out easier because the elastic tissue essentially just squeezes the air out for you. Second, In between all the alveoli, you have all of these pores. So let's say this pore gets blocked with mucus, no big deal. We still have that pore, that pore, that pore. So there's still backup channels to make sure that air can still get into an alveolus unless every single one of those gets blocked somehow. The third one is about how we remain sterile. Now again, reality is it's not really sterile, but you have to consider it sterile from a medical standpoint. The purple cells in this picture are macrophages, alveolar macrophages. They run around and eat any pathogens that made it down into the lungs so that your lungs don't get an overwhelming infection. All right, I'm going to finish you off with this picture for this video, and then we'll talk more about other stuff in a subsequent video later on. This is all about the lower respiratory system. So again, your right lung has a superior lobe, a middle lobe, and then an inferior lobe. You can also see the pleura, which is the serous membrane that surrounds each lung in this picture. They didn't show you that in the earlier pictures. The left lung just has two lobes, the superior and then the inferior. The fissures are what separate each lobe, and you can see the names to those off over on the side. Diaphragm is again that prime mover for inspiration. You can also see intercostal muscles, which are the muscles between the two ribs in any one place. So intercostal muscle, intercostal muscle, intercostal muscle. Then what the picture has done is it's blown up the serous membrane, the pleura that surrounds each lung. So remember the basic anatomy of a serous membrane is we have a parietal layer, fluid-filled space, and then we have a visceral layer. So we have the parietal pleura, the pleural cavity, and then the visceral pleura right there. This is going to be super important for lung function. It's not like the heart where it just reduces friction. This layer is critically important for lung function, and so you've got to make sure you know that anatomy. We'll pick up just after this picture in the next video.